Welcome everybody to a wonderful Legends and Lectures where I have a very special guest who we've been trying to get on this program for so long, and it's been my fault because we tried to do something last year and it didn't work out. But now the wonderful, the glorious, the lupine, Dr. Kaja Franck or Frank is here with us to tell us about her new research. So for those who don't know you, I call you Dr. Werewolf in common parlance, but please tell everybody what you do and and a little bit about your current research.
So I'm Dr. Kaja Franck, but I will go by any old name. That's absolutely not a problem. Only the other night, one of my children said, "You're not a doctor." And I said, "No, I am a doctor. You know this." And then they looked at me and went, "Yeah, but you're not a proper doctor." And I was like, "Fair point. You were right."
Oh God, what
Uh,
are you, my mother? That's like the worst.
it was, I was like, "Okay, fine. Okay, I'll take it." Um, So what I my area of research is broadly in literature. And so I'm definitely I read books, but I do expand beyond that in terms of like TV and film. I'm a gothicist by trade, so I look at the gothic, but that really does overlap with horror. And I'm really someone where the moment you try and put me into a box or give me a definition for what I study, I get really angsty and I'm like, no, I also do this, this, and this. And I have quite a flighty brain, so I pick around. So I'd probably say, like, I started off in vampires in my undergraduate and then my master's, and then my PhD, I went to werewolves. And then interestingly, I sort of then moved away from werewolves, and then bumped into someone who said, like, why haven't you published your thesis yet? I'm going to put you in contact with my editor. And then so I've kind of gone back to werewolves, but alongside the werewolves, I'm now doing like gothic dance, particularly ballet. And also, I like anything that's kind of like about how the natural world is gothic or horrifying. So I've also published on troll horror, on like Polidori, and hopefully a little later this year, before the close of 2025, I'll have my first article published on shark horror and on the film Sous la Seine, which came out last summer on Netflix. So yeah, I'm a jack of all trades when it comes to just if it interests me, I'm gonna have a look at it.
Fantastic. We actually got in touch because I remember I was writing about the werewolves of Ossory, and I'd asked you for literary things for medieval werewolves, and you gave me a whole spreadsheet about about your PhD. So can you tell us a little bit about that research that you did for your original PhD?
Absolutely. So I always think I've spoken a bit, I think, about my PhD journey, but I always think it's really useful because now that I talk to, so I have a PhD student myself, Harley Tillotson, and they're brilliant, and they look at ecogothic fairies in young adult fiction. But now that I talk to aspiring PhD students, I find myself being really quite brutally honest, but also having to admit that like my journey in some ways was incredibly easy. So all that happened was like in January, I was like, I think I want to do a PhD. It's the new year, I feel angsty. And then I sent one message to a chap who I'd met on like the conference circuit. And he said, "Oh, there's like a studentship, which is where you get the fees paid and a very small bursary. And I mean, very small bursary. I don't look a gift horse in the mouth and everything, but I think we have to be realistic about what funding is like when it comes to PhDs.
Hmm.
You know, under Dr. Sam George at the University of Hertfordshire. And so I applied and I wrote up a whole proposal about how I was going to look at why there's an increasing number of texts that have not just werewolves or vampires, but werewolves and vampires and fairies, and what that tells us about an increasingly complex multicultural society, and how identity formation and identity politics goes alongside changes in popular culture. And so I had an interview, and one of the panelists said, "So this is great, but this is like a life's work. So you're not going to do this, are you?" And I was like, "Oh, okay, fine, whatever you say, no, I won't." And at which point, Sam said, "Do werewolves and in literature specifically. And I was like, yeah, sure. So I'll probably say anything if you let me do my PhD. Um, so I then basically started the project with werewolves literature. Go. First 3 or 4 months was simply sitting in the British Library, um, read deciding like what is werewolf literature? Is there actually a body of werewolf literature? When do I want to start looking at werewolf literature? So when do I think that we start seeing recurring tropes that suggest that they're in conversation with each other as opposed to just one-off? What is a werewolf? That was another good one that I went with. And then essentially, what is there out there in terms of analysis of the figure of the werewolf and what is missing? And fundamentally, very quickly, I was like, everything about werewolves seems to be about how they're a metaphor for humans. And none of it really seems to be about the fact that like there's a wolf involved. And that was genuine. Honestly, within like a month, I was like, I want to think about the wolf. And that was the beginning of it. And alongside this, as you said, I'd been looking at Christopher Frayling's work on vampires, so sort of seminal text vampires. Um, and in that, he has a table of different vampire texts, and he breaks it down into sort of like the traits he was looking at, see if there was patterns. And I decided to do that. I'm quite a formulaic person, so I always say this is confusing. My brain is chaotic, but in order to prevent that from completely leading me astray, I have to do things like have really clear organization channels and systems and what have you, or I will never manage to get anything done. And so having a table really made sense to me because I find tables visually very easy for me to organize thoughts and recognize patterns.
So you touched on it a little bit, but let's ask the question, what is a werewolf exactly? Because, as you said, in depending on the literature, whether it's early or late, whether it's prehistoric or modern, what is a werewolf? Is it somebody who just turns into a wolf? Is it somebody who has agency over the turning? Is it a wolf that can talk? What is a werewolf?
I mean, I still don't know. So if you're yeah, if your listeners want to write in with their suggestions, I will be honest that my basis for this was in a pub after work. And I was working at the Globe Theatre at the time as a tour guide. And I sat down with all my colleagues who are not, well, some of them are actually academics, but this isn't their area of specialism. They work at Shakespeare's Globe. They typically like Renaissance drama. And yes, there is like one instance in the Duchess of Malfi, but we'll get to that. And I said to them, guys, what's a werewolf? And I literally just was like, everything they said, and I was like, okay, cool, cool, cool. And when I saw overlaps, I was like, that's what I'm working with, basically. I was like, I was more interested in sort of like, what is it in the popular imagination rather than going, well, actually, there's a text that's 80,000 years old and there's something in there. And I'm like, yeah, but like, no one's read that. Like, so what is it like? If I just talk to the man on the street, what is a werewolf? So for me, fundamentally, as I see the werewolf, I would say, and I'm going to have so many like, the general pattern is blah, blah, blah. I can't say absolutely. You do get a transformation between human and wolf. Typically, I think this has been typified as masculine, particularly in Western culture. Um, but what I do tend to say is that not every man into wolf transformation is a werewolf. And that's partly to do with things like what I have seen is the tendency for um, people to almost get really excited with the thing like that could be a werewolf, spotting werewolves across the world. And I'm always quite careful to say, well, it might deal with similar themes, like, well, what is the line between human and animal, and so forth. But I tend to say that for me, I tend to think of as a werewolf as there must be some elements of it that are kind of monstrous,
Mm.
because the to me the crucible of like how we understand the werewolf is specifically a kind of a Western figure, and that there is this aspect of monstrosity for me. That doesn't have to remain, and certainly it isn't the case now. And it doesn't have to be an absolute. You're always going to find outliers. As for whether someone has will over that happens, again, I'm like, I actually am not that fussed. I'm like, well, it could be either way, because I think it's quite interesting either way, and I like to have that bit of variety there. So whether they need to remember what they do, whether they, I don't know, use a girdle of human skin, make a deal with the devil, get bitten, choose to get bitten, are born. All of this is where I think, well, variety is the, is the spice of life, as it were.
Yeah,
So
because
yeah, that's a useless answer. I don't know.
no, I think that's great because I mean the whole concept, of the shape changing aspect of it is in many ancient cultures. People putting on wolf skins or assuming the spirit or the role of a wolf. Is that a werewolf? I don't know. I mean, linguistically speaking, yeah, we could talk about, where the word comes from, but is that the definition? I don't know. There's also all the changed husband motif, which we see a lot in lays. I mean, technically, if we look at I mean, Beauty and the Beast is 1740, but if we look at something like Beauty and the Beast, is he a werewolf? I don't know the answer to that question because technically he doesn't really fit, as you said, the parameters of what we would consider to be because he's enchanted, but he's not necessarily a werewolf. He can't change himself. What does that mean? There's also, or even looking at something like Gilgamesh, where technically we've got the first mention of a werewolf in there. But again, is that what we would consider to be werewolf, or even Lycaon, or even the Ovid's Metamorphoses, or things like that? We don't know. Early Christian authors, Augustine of Hippo, talking about werewolves in the city of God. Is that what we would consider to be a werewolf? I mean, my homies are the werewolves of Ossory in general, but in Ireland. But even then, there's earlier mentions of werewolves in Ireland, but they don't call them that. They, in 1680, when in the Annals of the Four Masters, they're just like, oh yeah, four werewolf guys, four werewolf warriors showed up at a castle, and they were wronged by some dude, and they wanted their money back. And you go, oh, okay, but they don't change. So are they wolf warriors? Are they werewolves? What's the story here? So that obviously we can go into the sagas, but I think really because since our modern concept of a werewolf, I think really the two biggies, or maybe the one biggie, is Bisclavret. And so for those who don't, or and maybe also by extension Guillaume de Palerme. So by extension, do you think that these two are really the beginning of the Western werewolf in literature?
So no, I'm going to be really annoying. I think they can fall under. It's really hard because I mean, as you're saying, all of this. So like, I think in the Gilgamesh, I wouldn't necessarily call that a werewolf.
Hmm.
Um, and but again, like I'm not that fussed if other people want to. So if other people are like, look, I want a pedigree to my monster, and I want to say I chose that word specifically. I want to say, like, it goes all the way back to Gilgamesh. I'm like, yeah, cool, okay. Because it is so fluid and it is so interpretation, and a lot of it is around issues around translation.
Yeah.
So, what do I translate that as? Do I translate it as werewolf? But of course, what I'm translating it is to a very modern usage of werewolf. I'm not translating it to werewolf etymologically correctly to the history of that particular word, because of course then words become divorced from their original usage and etymology. Hence you get these cases where they're using a word that we recognize as werewolf, but you're like, but it doesn't otherwise seem to be, it's the words there, but the other traits aren't there.
Yeah.
So I think I find Guillaume de Pellin, I think, is interesting because it is translated as William the Werewolf. And I think that's interesting because that's not actually what the title is.
Yeah.
I'm not great at French, but even with my rudimentary French, it's like basically William of Palerme. But then it's like in translation, I was interested about that in translation. clearly there now seemed to be being utilized in the English language a term werewolf that was starting to have quite distinct parameters. So almost the translation of that was interesting to me. As for I can never pronounce it, Bisclavret, welcome to the world of literature studies. You spend all your time reading, you never say the word out loud. I yeah, again, I think that's functionally there are so many elements that yes, there's someone transforming into a wolf, and there's ideas about civility and what makes you human and what makes you civil and what makes you courtly. But there's something that makes me think kind of it's there, but it's not necessarily going for me right into then we get into this monstrosity. It feels like an alternative offshoot where we're using that same like figure, that same idea of transformation and animal transformation, but we're actually having a discussion about something else. And I'm interested you brought up Beauty and the Beast because in some ways I almost feel Beauty and the Beast, even though it doesn't appear to be lupine in a lot of the
Yeah.
adaptations. I think in some ways that actually I find probably more of an underlying trait of what then went in because it is about there is a fear there. There is a threat of violence that comes through this animality. Whereas I always get like, Marie de France writes about a really very pleasant
Yeah.
wolf.
That's what I think
Yeah,
is
more
interesting
like a
about
pet.
both Bisclavret, Guillaume de Palerme, and also Melian by extension.
Mm.
All of these ideas are the werewolf is a good character and is somebody who has been wronged. And and then obviously they people help the werewolf or the werewolf helps other people. And then the werewolf is able then to either transform back or they're no longer cursed. There's something, but the werewolf is the good character who has something bad done to them. And I think that's really interesting how suddenly, somewhere in the late 1400s, early 1500s, that whole thing changes. And I don't know if it's because of the werewolf trials. I don't know if it's because of other stories. Something happens where the werewolf character or that shape-changing wolf character goes from being good or a character who is represented as somebody who has been hurt by society or wronged by to the complete opposite, where the werewolf is now a figure of either bestiality or violence, as you said. There's that suddenly that negative aspect to the violence, where werewolves earlier were asked to use their violence for good, and then suddenly now they're being asked to use their violence for bad, or they do in these certain stories. So what do you think it is? Why do you think we have that shift in our ideas of what werewolves are around that time?
Again, and I think this is really interesting. My suspicion, and this is where I always find it, so I tend not to look as far back as that period. And my suspicion is partly we don't, it's really hard to know how many stories are being told about man into wolf transformations because we know, of course, that the access to printing was almost non-existent. So the text that we have, maybe that was everything that was being printed at the time. I believe that seems very unlikely. Maybe there was significantly more being printed. Maybe as well, like there were lots of oral narratives and they are gone. And the examples that you've given of sort of Melian, Guillaume de Palerme, that fundamentally like that's three stories that have this common thread to them, but they are also stories that are actually about really more the upper classes.
Uh,
So I always see them as sort of fitting with a wider discussion of chivalry. I would be really interested. I don't know. It's really not like this is way beyond my ability in terms of sort of like archival research and what have you. I wonder whether, as I said, there's like multiple narratives and whether it's just that which one piques the common interest. And I feel like the werewolf trials are going to pique the common interest because, well, I know they're actually like the werewolf trials are real occurrences of legal trials, but they end up kind of being represented kind of tabloid-esque. And they're far more for I my feeling as well is that general consumption. And then that's kind of when we start getting this kind of well, we haven't changed. We still like true crime. That has not changed at all. And and I also, like, for me as well, like a lot of what I say in my research, because of my viewpoint, is that a lot of it is to do with relationships between human and wolves. And that as we start seeing the growth and reliance economically on sheep, well, then suddenly you start seeing wolves as demonic. And although the language in the Christian church isn't necessarily specifically about werewolves outside of the werewolf trials, we then start seeing these interesting metaphors coming up about the idea of the flock of God and the Lamb of God. And it plays into pre existing structures within the Bible, but it also is kind of built because, again, the other thing about the Bible is mainly what we're dealing with is translations. And so I'm always really amused by that because again, I'm not a biblical scholar and nor am I a scholar of physical geography, but it does amuse me how, like, the version that I see in the UK of what the Christian landscape looks like is an English landscape with sheep. And I'm like, that's interesting because when I was a lot younger, we lived in Jordan and I don't have many memories of it, but I do have memories of being in the desert and seeing Petra and things like that. And from my memory, not that many green and pleasant sort of we basically, it wasn't built, we're building New Jerusalem. It was a very different looking sort of space. And so I'm always nuanced there. So my gut instinct for me, from my perspective, this has probably got to do with something, a changing relationship. And I'm also conscious that in the 1400s, we probably have more of a relationship with animals where they are symbolically being used because they are being on shields, and they're sort of chivalric entities as well. So yeah, really useless answer again because I just love. I'm going to be the world. They're going to invite me on a TED talk, and I'm going to be like, "Hey, I'll be on a TED talk where I'll just be like, probably don't have a simple answer for that. Going to need to give you more
Well,
context, and it will
I
be
don't
30,000 hours."
I don't think there is a simple answer, and that's why I asked this question to other people we've interviewed about this because what is it that I mean, of the big one obviously is in 1589, thanks Powerwolf. 1589 was the Werewolf of Bedburg, right? And so you look at Peter Staub or Peter Stamp and you look at this and you go, where did this come from? Why this guy? And I think, I mean, obviously he was convicted of things that he did do, which he was accused of things like incest and cannibalism. But then, interestingly, because he was named the Werewolf of Bedburg, those sort of crimes continued to be labeled as werewolf crimes. So you have like the Werewolf of Chalon, you have the Nicolas Damont, you have Gilles Garnier, and all these other people. Again, it was serial killer, cannibal, incest. Again, it just kept the Werewolf of Dole, all of these things in the was it Jan Oyke in Rent. Again, the same thing in 1652. All the same crimes are now being, oh, he's a werewolf because he did all these things. So what is it about those crimes that suddenly became attached to werewolves? Or is it the other way where they had to explain all these crimes, maybe in a landscape that was also where religion was changing very drastically at the time in Europe? So why it's so interesting. Again, why did they pick werewolves suddenly as this whole thing? I agree with you, and I think it's a very interesting question, and I don't think it's a simple answer, but I think it's interesting that just they label these types of crimes in a time where we don't have a lot of literature about werewolves. Suddenly, these are werewolf crimes. You go, oh, okay, that's a really random thing to pick. Why not vampire crimes? Why not fairy crimes? Why not, in your book, you write the werewolf arrives in English literature during the early 1800s, and literary lycanthropy occurs. You said you were going to talk about the Duchess of Malfi, but I think interestingly, because Duchess of Malfi is 1623, and I think it's very interesting that suddenly again the Duchess of Malfi takes this accusation of werewolfism, but it suddenly becomes a mental illness rather than a physical crimes. Can you talk about the Duchess of Malfi for a bit?
See, and I want to say, like, I think what your point about the Werewolf of Bedburg is something that I find really interesting because one of the notable things is the pamphlet about its crimes was translated into English
Hmm.
and then disseminated. And that isn't cheap. It's easier. It's easier than it was in the 1400s, but it's not super easy, which means someone was like, this is going to sell or this
Uh,
is going to be of interest. And I always wonder whether that's the work of Leslie Scondutu about I found really useful here, in terms of ideas about, well, when do we start moving from these true crimes in inverted commas to, oh, actually this is now something that we're consuming almost as though it isn't real. A thing I think we still do today. We still use the language of monstrosity. We still use that spacing aspect when we talk about who we deem to be the worst crimes. I also think as well that, like, as you said, like in the Dutch of Malfi, it's dealt with as a mental illness. What I found quite interested is that in the cases of the werewolf, in the werewolf trials, there's not an absolute one way that we deal with this. So in some cases, like I'm thinking particularly Jean Grenier, they essentially just like, yeah, this lad is not okay. So he probably has committed some of these crimes, but we're not going to put him to death because, well, he's kind of a sad case. Like, what are we going to do? Like, we can put him to death, but he's obviously, basically, like, he's obviously not turning into a wolf, guys, and he's not made friends with the devil. And I find that so fun. And they're like, it's just, oh, we're just going to lock him up in a monastery, aren't we? Like, ah. And I find that really interesting because, again, it's not as though they become over time more, in inverted commas, humane or understanding or nuanced in their idea. It flicks back and forth depending on different decades, different countries, suggesting that a lot of the way that we react to crime is really broadly about social pressure. And so that any of us at any given moment, including now today, can be whipped up into a moral panic and can ask for violent extremism. But what does come out, as you said, is that the Duchess of the Duchess of Malfi, it's a clear mention of lycanthropy, and I like it because it's very nerdy. So Webster's done a bit of reading, and I like to think, I mean, I don't know, I like to think Webster read about this like, that's just a great image. Like, it's just a really literary image. Like, I'm hairy, but on the inside, says Duke Ferdinand. You know, he says like he says that he's a werewolf, but it's also a metaphor being eaten up by guilt and shame, and that makes sense because wolves by this point were overburdened with symbolism of being ravenous and evil, and so I feel for me that's kind of like Webster being like, oh, great, well, this is just going to play well. You've got relationship to these prior werewolf crimes, so general public know what this is. So you've already got the symbolism there, but also it just works really visually, really in a really good way. And even better, it means you don't have to worry about how you're going to do special effects on stage.
yeah.
And so much of Renaissance drama can be summed up on how can we do this, but we can't do it on stage. This is
Yes.
well before you've got John Landis in your team. So I genuinely am like, it's like, even better. So he's kind of a werewolf, but I don't actually have to show it. Great. In.
That's sort of you in your book you talk a bit about this where you're talking about Victorian Gothic literature as well, and it's interesting the shift in history again toward like representations of work because we do have several female werewolves as well, but it seems like with the female werewolves throughout it, it's always that internalizing, it's always that mental aspect of like, oh, the shame, the guilt of me being a wolf, whereas with male werewolves, maybe not now but in history, it's always that violence aspect or that animalistic aspect. But but with women, it's exactly. But and it seems like it's more acceptable for women in history to be werewolves than it is for men to be werewolves, which again is kind of interesting. In your book, you talk about the resurgence in the Gothic literature. So how did werewolves get their Gothic resurgence?
Well, I think again, and I always feel that I'm the person who goes to these really quite mundane things. Like, well, it was to do with the staging's just really difficult if you put a werewolf on stage. But I do think that like as it becomes sort of into the 1800s, and we can more clearly, the idea of capitalism and the idea of the importance of getting things printed and published and produced and read has to a certain degree always been there, if not as formal. But I think with the 1800s, you've got quite a few things that are happening socially. You do have a significantly more literate population. You do have cheaper access to being able to publish texts. Um, and you also now have a movement where it isn't just to go all the way back to Melian and Guillaume Palerme and Bisclavret, it isn't just the upper classes who are kind of the deciders of taste. And I'm sure there are people who are like medievalists who are like, that's never been the case. And I'm sure that's absolutely correct. But please forgive me, like, this really isn't my specialism. Um, but I really am interested, I think, in this idea of like, we enjoy reading about monsters. We
We do.
enjoy reading pamphlets. We do. And I think that when it came to things like the resurgence in the 1800s, we have people who are looking for ideas, they're wanting to publish. We're starting to get people who are genuinely making a living. They're not necessarily the richest. People are making a living from writing and not necessarily through patronage. They know what's going to sell, and they have an audience baying for more. And what they also have is far more access as well, to earlier texts. So they are actually able to research. And then you have this really fun thing where some of the ideas that we see in sort of early 1800s short stories seem to pay, werewolves tend to pay a lot of homage to that werewolf trial, but with all the Gothic trappings of like, oh, stick it in a Roman Catholic country in the south of France because we feel real weird about that. And then you see that resurgence again in the early 20th century. I think the sort of the weird writers, where you see them again, sort of again a similar pressure of being a jobbing writer, wanting to engage with that folklore-esque vibe, that veneer of authenticity, I call it, that sense of making the reader think, well, maybe this does happen because maybe this author has read something or knows something I don't know, and they're saying it's about the past and folklore and history and true crime, so maybe it's actually real. And then you get to play with that, essentially, the thing we do whenever we watch horror, which is maybe it is real. We'd love it if it was. Well,
It is, but not in the way that we like, I think. I think we would like there to be more werewolves and vampires and less serial killers in the world. You know?
yeah,
And you had mentioned also
I
that people love a pamphlet and people love a scandal. I think honestly, even though technically the Beast of Gévaudan, which we did, it was never mentioned as a werewolf. I if for the for or Bête de Gévaudan for our French friends, um, for the that's quite a famous case where people thought it was it's like, oh, was it a giant wolf? Was it a werewolf? Was it there was an idea that maybe it was an escaped lion, etc. But the whole mystery of that animal, whatever it was, absolutely captured people. And now we've got movies about it, and now we've got books about it, etc. And I think you are right in that aspect that we just love a great mystery. We love a story, and if we can attach a werewolf or another monster to it, I think that that's even better. Speaking of which, you have a whole section in your book about Dracula, which you call a wolf in vampire's clothing, which I do agree with you, and I think it's very interesting. There are many parallels with Dracula and werewolf lore, and you also call Stoker's protagonist very lupine. So how do you think Dracula is really actually a werewolf story?
Well, I think the thing is that it's. I found it interesting. I didn't include all of these, but if you go and you do some research on sort of reviews of Dracula when it first came out, there's not an absolute this is a story about vampires. You see a lot of the reviews talking, oh, it's some kind of werewolf vampire type thing. They're not hugely impressed with the text, but they're reviewing it and they seem to be like, well, it kind of could be either, suggesting that at the time, it genuinely could be either. And I think it's just that with the adaptations, again, I can't help thinking partly because it's just easier to make him a vampire than a werewolf. With the adaptations, they kind of set him up as a vampire. For me, it's back to research. Um, For all, I find it frustrating that when people sort of say, "Oh, Gilgamesh is absolutely the first werewolf," nothing makes me happier than when I read a novel that says that. Like if I'm reading an author who's writing about werewolves and they have done their research and they're like, "Werewolves, they do exist. They have always existed. See, I have done my research." Blah 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 blah. I'm like, yes, this is a wonderful trope. I love this so much. It's just weirdly when it's more in academia that I'm like, I mean, I want them to exist, but I'm not sure we're ever going to find out they exist. Um, but
That's
yeah,
what
with
they want you
Dracula,
to
I think
think.
exactly. So again, I love this in books. It's amazing. Or any fictional text, it makes me so happy. Like I watched What We Do in the Shadows with my husband, and in the opening, I was like, "Would you like me to pause it on every shot and explain to you where that came from?" And he was like, "Absolutely not. What's wrong with you?" And I was like, "Just it's actually like it's really it's you won't get that, but that's really funny. Like that's a reference to Nosferatu, a film you've never watched and don't really care about. But that's fine. It's really funny. You're missing a lot here. I love that sort of thing. Like Kim Newman's Anno Dracula. I once spent an evening reading it with a book of just like Victorian vampire stories and like cross-referencing. That was the night my husband was out. Otherwise, I think he probably would never have married me at that point. To come back to Dracula, like the thing is Stoker did research.
Yeah.
And whilst I absolutely share concerns about how he depicts Romany people, how he depicts Romania more broadly, how he depicts sort of like Eastern Europe, what he's saying with a very Victorian, an Anglo-Irish Victorian viewpoint towards what it means to be civilized, and with a lot of proto, if not outright, eugenicist ideas coming through. Again, I always have to say, like, I don't mean this consciously. I mean this like literally. He's living at a time. He's talking with people. If I wrote a book now, it would be infused with what's currently happening, and people would be able to be like, she definitely has avocado on toast for an irrational number of days of the week. And so I think that Stoker does do his research, and what really intrigued me is that, again, even if his sources aren't the best sources, and they're not, he's engaging with them really interestingly, and he is inspired by them, and he's almost treating them like a literary text themselves, and like and one of the sources that I think people maybe don't realize, or although I'm sure your listeners will know, but it's worth repeating. One of the sources he uses is Sabine Baring-Gould's The Book of Werewolves,
Hmm.
which, as the title suggests, is about werewolves, not vampires. And there are these really, really interesting physical aspects of Dracula, like having a monobrow, which again we all forget about in his adaptations. They didn't give Gary Oldman a monobrow, but that would have been hilarious. Even actually his fangs as well, these pointed canines, hair on the palm, the lengthened ring finger. These are all things. Oh, the color of his nails as well. These are all things that have been taken from descriptions of werewolves, and in particular, Jean Grenier and other accused werewolves during the werewolf trials from Baring-Gould's Werewolves. So these go in, and then they just get subsumed in the idea that these are actually traits of vampires, again, particularly the fangs. But at the same time, to go back to your question, what is a werewolf? Well, arguably, Dracula can change
That's
into a
right.
wolf-like creature.
That's right.
And if that's our like, we will call anything that changes into a like man into wolf transformation a werewolf until it comes to Dracula, and they were like, no, in that case, that's a vampire. And I think it's because vampires have better PR.
And usually better clothes and good hair, or at least in modern times, anyway. Well, I mean, Vampire the Masquerade, the game, in the White Wolf universe, they do have a subsect of vampires that are actually more wolf-like. They're more wolf-like than they are vampires. So if you're a werewolf person, but you want to play a vampire, so you would pick that clan, which is essentially they align themselves with wolves. Or even in some, I mean, to be fair, like Castlevania is based on Dracula anyway, but something like Alucard, right, where he could turn into a gaseous cloud, but he can also turn into a giant wolf. So Is he a vampire? Is he a werewolf? Again, I think you're absolutely on it when you say that Dracula is the one who immediately blurs those modern lines where you just go, well, he's kind of both, isn't he? So,
Absolutely. And I think again, I'm always sort of like, do what you want, they don't exist. I know we were talking before about how often, like, I feel that academia really, obviously I'm an academic. I will argue until I'm blue in my face, and I'm dying on so many hills. They are going to have to like chop me up to put my corpse on different hills for me to die on. And I have all sorts of pet peeves and things that irritate me and what have you in terms of phrases, and my colleagues have theirs, and sometimes they overlap and we do things that annoy each other. But I will say that I do think it does feel sometimes a bit forced when I have to really sort of say I hate X, Y, and Z, but I'm like I talk about monsters and I don't believe they exist. So there's who cares? Do what you want. Call everything a werewolf. Call nothing a werewolf. As long as you're not harming people, and that's my only concern is where is it that maybe we absorb very complex folk traditions, indigenous traditions, and beliefs into this higher academic purpose of giving pedigree to my research, as opposed to saying, actually, that exists in its own right, and it doesn't need to fall under the werewolf label necessarily. It can just be a man into wolf transformation, and more off. And honestly, how interesting that so many cultures have creatures that transform from human to animal. How interesting that they often tend to be the apex predator or a predator in that area. How interesting that there are undead creatures and blood-sucking creatures across the world. To me, that's really, really interesting, because in each case, that suggests to me like just the human desire to understand whilst recognizing we cannot understand, and so the supernatural comes in as that conduit between the two.
you touched on it in saying that everybody kind of does their own thing with monsters nowadays, and werewolves especially are now having a bit of a resurgence. So they're figures that everybody loves, including myself. So and I write about them too. So why do you think werewolves are now become the cuddly heroes? Because in your book you talk about the hopeful werewolf. Why do you think now, especially now, they're so popular in all these different aspects?
Well, firstly, I do very much feel like have a be like, okay, werewolves are, werewolves are kind of high, they're getting quiet now. There's not as many of them. When I finished my PhD, I am just like, geez, where did you all come from? Where, indeed. Um, I think back to the fact that fundamentally, I think we are still concerned about our relationship with non-human animals, and we are particularly concerned with recognizing where what humans have done to our natural world. And I feel like werewolves and wolves, and this is where I kind of bring them together, are so significant there. I do see and I do chart, and I'm sure again people will have other perception of this, but I do chart a direct sort of relationship between particularly British colonialism and the destruction of indigenous wolf populations. So, on the British Isles, it often surprises people that British Isles used to have wolves and bears. We had a whole range. And one of the things that actually made, in some ways, the Britain so successful economically was that we were able to kill a lot of these populations, and we were able to do massive deforestation. And then what you can do is have a lot of sheep, and we were able to have a lot of sheep safely at a time when that was really significant. But at the same time, I think like the killing of the wolves in England is also a lot to do about symbolically civilizing the land. And then you start see as the Celtic nations, we then do the same. I'm saying we because I'm an English person, and the English then sort of do the same thing to Wales first. And then we see significantly the destruction of the wolf population under things like Oliver Cromwell, which is absolutely going alongside what is a genocide of the Irish people as well. And then with Sen, we see it up into Scotland. And I always say rather darkly, but my sense of humour is dark, that we started at home. The violence was at home. The call was coming from inside the house. And we basically were like, you can destroy a people by destroying their land, destroying their relationship to their indigenous animals, to their landscape, to their flora and fauna, to their stories about that. We can replace it with other things. And then voila, that's how you essentially fully and colonize in a very totalitarian way. And I feel that that then got rolled out. And then we see this as well, sort of, and it's not just the British as well. Europe really likes colonizing. We've got a problem. We should all sit down as many countries and just be like, we've all got a problem here, and I think we need to talk about it, guys. And but I think again, like you then see sort of wolf population destruction in Europe, and then you see it happening again once we get to North America and so forth. What you then see is us all going, oh, bollocks. We really must stop doing this. We're destroying things and we are having an impact. And then you kind of get this nostalgia. And then rising in the 20th century, I think you then start getting a real sense of like what becomes sort of early conservationism and then outright conservationism in the late 20th century, and a real understanding almost of like the ongoing impact of what has been hundreds of years of decimation of, apart from other things, the wolf population. And so in the late 20th century, you get the reintroduction of wolves, particularly in the parks. And I feel very weird because obviously, like, you're like, yes, I know all this. You're the nation that has no wolves and no wilderness space. Although I'm iffy about the word wilderness, but we'll get to that another time. But essentially, then we get the reintroduction of wolves. And I think there will always be a place for the big, scary werewolf, because the werewolf is not just a metaphor for human wolf relationships. I can see that. It depends on the context. That's why I haven't included every werewolf text, because not every werewolf text is like, I can't necessarily do that with Teen Wolf from the 1980s. I don't think that's a metaphor for human wolf relationships. There are aspects that I think that's a metaphor for male puberty. I
Ginger
think that's why
Snaps
we,
is the same for the female way, so yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And I think we see, yeah, so for me, I think that's why we start seeing this softening, because in some ways it is kind of an understanding of perhaps letting the wolf into your house and accepting it. And again, it comes alongside a broader tendency towards a wider liberalism towards differing identities. And we do see that across the board, I think, with all monsters almost, that there is space for monstrous versions of it and space for where we say, actually, what did that previously represent and why is that now a problem now?
So, I'm sure you know that, especially in like the last 10 years, werewolves have become a very big mascot for the LGBT community. And so but again, in a positive sort of way, where you feel that again, that relationship between humans of people feeling like they have something inside of them that they cannot show or that maybe they're afraid to show. And werewolves have now sort of become a mascot of celebrating that difference or being part of that difference. And I think it's interesting that whereas maybe the werewolves also have that early 20th century moment of the rewilding of certain areas that we've destroyed, it now is sort of a mascot of reclaiming part of ourselves or part of humanity that we've sort of suppressed or pushed away. And I think when people talk about classic werewolf tropes like changing by the moon, which is sort of ancient, there are a couple of old examples of that, or like being killed with a silver bullet, which is very modern. Um, I think that now there's so much more accept, especially this time of the year because we're recording this near Halloween, which is the greatest time of the year, of course. But in even that gothic werewolf, people go back to that gothic werewolf, and again, there's something delicious there. There's something where people go, "Ooh, sexy, I must have," and suddenly we need to deliciate over it, and we need to know. Even something like Dracula, where he's kind of both. He's become this sort of, especially in modern interpretations of Dracula, like the Castlevania animated series, where he's become this symbol of retribution against the evil church, or retribution against the sins of man instead of being an aspect of the sins of man. I think that modern interpretations are much fairer to the monster and less fair to humanity. And it's interesting to see how we've sort of come full circle on that spectrum over 500 years.
Well, yeah, I agree, and I was interested what you're saying because I think about sort of queer wolves
That's a great one.
is I know it's not mine. I read it somewhere. It's wonderful, but I think there's there is innate because monstrosity has a certain campness innately to it
Mm,
because it is very much a performance. And again, because when we think about the history of production of film and TV and how many LGBTQ plus people have been involved in it, but have not necessarily been able to be open on screen, even if often they were open behind the scenes, because that's a trope that goes all the way back to like Elizabethan period and before. Um, I think there's a lot of fun to be had. That sort of like I'm being a monster, but you actually didn't know that according to your mores and standards, like you actually would see me as monstrous. So we're playing with that tension there. The other thing I think about werewolves is, well, again, increasingly with the exception of something like ginger snaps, they're often seen as like these hulky, bristling symbols of masculinity. And then we can get into sort of bear culture and we can get into these ideas again of performance of gender and how that is so aligned with sexuality. So when you start taking heterosexuality out of the mix, then you get this like really interesting aspect of how much is gender a performance. And so you can have these like big hairy werewolf guys, but also they're gay, which had at some point, you know, which has been associated with femininity. So then you get the hyper masculinity. And I love I have to say, like this stuff, I one, I love Halloween, two, I love performance, and three, I find it so amusing when people send up expectations of sexuality and gender. It gives me a real sense of fun and joy and pleasure. So I'm not a member of the LGBTQ plus community myself, but I'm involved at my university with I'm the ally rep. As I always say, well, you've got to have one token cis het person, or and I get to be her. Um, but I really love this reclamation. I find it tongue in cheek. I like the fact that you're playing into still some of society's worst fears. It brings me such pleasure. I can't tell you. I That's why kind of one of the reasons why I got into this area of research. That very quickly I realized that like these are the funnest conferences because people have a really good sense of humor, and that most people are just sort of taking the mick out of themselves. They understand that like I live in a world where people ask what I do, and I'm like, well, I research monsters. And when they stop asking me whether I believe this, and I'm like, oh, do you ask people who are specialists at Jane Austen whether they think the Bennet sisters existed? No, of course you don't, because you can understand that. I don't know what it is about monsters where you think I believe it. Um, then you just have to have a good sense of humor because you do get a lot of like, well, my tax money, and you're like, your tax money, whatever, son.
The Eco-Gothic Werewolf in literature, Wolves, Woods, and Wilderness, is out right now. If you could, I have the digital copy. There it is. The Eco-Gothic Werewolf in Literature, by Dr. Kaja Franck. Thank you so much for finally being here and doing this with us, because it is really, werewolves are one of my favorite topics. They are certainly one of my favorite monsters, along the works. And it's just nice to have for I think it's also nice for people to know that this is a legitimate area of study. There is a point to werewolves and monsters in general. There is a for, like you said, it's a performance. Werewolves are used all the time in literature, in history, to either for crimes, for things people are ashamed of. They are the great pretenders, and as much as we would like them to be real, it's at least you can learn about them, and that's that.
Yeah, and I would say, like, I know, this has been a really relaxed and fun conversation, which is what I absolutely love. And you can tell I have a meandering mind, and I'm always connecting points. And I'm sure no one can believe I had the discipline to write the book. I don't think I really have. I can believe that I had that amount of discipline. I will say, like when you read my book, I really, like you're saying, I think about, I do. It is serious. Unfortunately, you won't be laughing every 5 minutes when you read this book. I do talk about the very real violence we've committed against the natural world, particularly what we did to wolves, which was absolutely horrific. And so I do think that, like, if people ask me, I think what I do is genuinely really important. And it matters to me. And I think people should know that, like, studying our deepest fears really, really matters, because fear and hatred, they go hand in hand. And if you can get people to fear, you can get them to do some really atrocious things. And so often, horror and gothic gives us a way to have insight into the wider machinations of how ideas work. I don't believe that Dracula caused, the novel Dracula did not cause the late 1800s panic about homosexuality. But what it does do is help us understand what was the most extreme ways that that language was expressed, and how that couldn't have been written unless things were being written in the newspapers, unless people were saying things about, like, people being unnatural or what have you, or describing them as a certain type. And so I would always say, like, I love what I do because it is fun and it's good. But the reason why it's fun and we make jokes is because we spend a lot of time, like, looking into the darkest depths of human depravity and fears and horror and the worst things we are capable of doing. Like, I love talking about cannibalism, and people are like, why? And I was like, it's a taboo. I Oh, honestly, last Christmas, my husband's like, what are you doing? I was like, I'm listening to a really cheerful Christmas story. And he was like, what's about? I was like, it's about down in the Andes, and they ended up eating each other. But,
Oh,
like, there's
classic.
snow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was like, there's snow. It's festive. We don't get snow in the UK. And he's like, Jesus Christ, that's not festive. I was like, it's one of the most beautiful stories of resilience, but it's about understanding what we do and who we are. So, yeah, that's why I like what I do, because I can have a sense of humor and I can also gross people out. And I can also be very aware of some of the ways that the language of Gothic and horror is around us all the time, and particularly how we make those who we fear into the other, and what can come after that if you're not careful.